In the harsh, unforgiving expanse of the Arctic, where the ice stretches endlessly and the cold can freeze the soul, there lies a story of survival, tragedy, and unrelenting human spirit. The Karluk, a ship once hailed as the hope for an ambitious polar expedition, became the center of one of the most harrowing tales of adventure in the history of Arctic exploration. Stranded in the frozen wilderness with no way out, a crew of men, women, and children faced an impossible fight against nature, starvation, and the forces of fate itself. From the moment the Karluk was trapped in the ice, every decision, every step taken, became a matter of life or death. What followed was a journey filled with extraordinary bravery, unexpected alliances, and the heartbreaking losses that would forever change the lives of those involved. This is the story of the Karluk, a voyage that would test the limits of human endurance and challenge the very nature of survival. Before we dive headlong into the 1913 Canadian Arctic expedition, I did want to give a bit of a preface. This may be a very long video, and as such, I may break it up into parts just to make it easier to consume. And this is due to two reasons. One, this is a very detailed story with many elements, and I want to try and cover as many of those elements as I can. And two, Arctic and Antarctic expeditions are a personal favorite of mine. Many of you will have been introduced to the topic by hearing about the Franklin expedition. I was personally introduced to the topic through the Terra Nova expedition led by Robert Falcon Scott. While there are hundreds, if not thousands, of expeditions into the snowy ends of our Earth, this one was one I had only learned about very recently. And as such, I want to do justice to the story as much as possible. I'll do my best to use bookmarks where I can so that you can jump around the video to where it seems most interesting to you. Thank you, and now back to the story. The Karluk was the flagship of the 1913 Canadian Arctic expedition. This was a scientific expedition destined for the Arctic Circle and was led by Wilhelmer Stefansson. The expedition was intended to be sponsored by the National Geographic Society and the American Museum of Natural History. However, the Government of Canada took over the sponsorship as the expedition had the potential to discover new land. Additionally, Stefansson was a born Canadian who held a U.S. citizenship and had recently returned to the country. Stefansson was born in Manitoba before studying in North Dakota, Iowa, and later Harvard. Stefansson was an anthropologist by trade. The expedition would consist of two parties, a northern and a southern party. The northern would be led by Stefansson, and the southern by Rudolf Martin Anderson. Interestingly, Anderson was the complete opposite of Stefansson. Anderson was born in the U.S., but migrated to and held a Canadian citizenship. Anderson was a well-known zoologist, explorer, and veteran of the Spanish-American War. Both men had previously worked together as explorers and conducted the Stefansson-Anderson Arctic expedition between 1908 and 1912. This expedition explored Alaska and the Yukon. The Northern Party was to explore new lands north and west of the known lands of the Canadian Arctic. At this time, the possibility that a large undiscovered landmass existed comparable in size to the Canadian Arctic Islands, or even a small continent, was scientifically possible. The approach of the Northern Party, besides simply going out and looking for land, was a program of thorough ice depth sounding to map the edges of the continental shelf, as well as meteorological, magnetic, and marine biological investigations. The Southern Party was tasked with scientific documentation of the geography, geology, resources, wildlife, and people of the Mackenzie River Delta. This is an area of Canada between Cape Parry and the Kent Peninsula, which is roughly about 160 kilometers inland and south of Victoria Island. Copper deposits, as well as trade routes, were of the highest interest to the Southern Party. The expedition would consist of 10 scientists, 13 crew members, 4 Inuit hunters, a seamstress, her 2 children, and 1 additional passenger, for a total of 31 people. I won't go through all 31 names here, but will mention some of the key players. The exploration party was comprised of experts from the US, Canada, Denmark, Norway, France, and Britain. Only 2 of these individuals, aside from Stefansson and Anderson, had any experience in the Arctic, one of which was Alistair Forbes Mackay, and he would be the chief medical officer. Mackay was part of the Ernest Shackleton Nimrod expedition in 1907. The second was also on the Nimrod expedition and had been part of the group that discovered the magnetic South Pole. This was James Murray, and he would act as the oceanographer. Aside from the 2 children that would later come on board, the youngest of the 2 in attendance for the expedition were William Laird McKinley, a 24-year-old science teacher from Glasgow, and 20-year-old Bjarne Mammon from Norway, who was a skiing champion. The ship, the Karluk, would be captained by 36-year-old Robert Bartlett. Robert had previously commanded the SS Roosevelt on both a 1906 and 1909 polar expedition. While Stefansson was the figurehead for the expedition, it would be Robert Bartlett, the second choice for captain by the way, who would become the true hero of this ill-fated journey. Robert Bartlett was born to a seafaring family, in what was considered at the time the colony of Newfoundland, since Newfoundland had not yet joined Canada. Bartlett was the oldest of 10 children, born to William James Bartlett and Mary J. Lehman. He grew up in Hawthorne College in Brigus, and by the age of 17, he had mastered his first ship and began a lifelong love affair with the Arctic. Bartlett would go on to spend more than 50 years mapping and exploring the waters of the far north, and led over 40 expeditions, more than anyone before or since. As previously mentioned, Bartlett was the captain of the SS Roosevelt before joining the Karluk, and he would accompany the United States Navy commander Robert Peary, who was actually the first selection for captain of the Karluk, in his attempt to reach the North Pole. Bartlett was awarded the Hubbard Medal of the National Geographic Society for breaking the trail through the frozen Arctic Sea. He would reach as close to 150 miles of the pole, but was excluded from the final exploration party due to a rivalry between Peary and Bartlett. On the same trip, Bartlett would take the ship and would be the first person to sail north of 88 degrees north. Troubles for the expedition began even before the Karluk set sail. While Bartlett was a very competent captain, he did not have time to pre-assemble the crew. As such, the crew was hastily put together at the Royal Navy dockyard in Esquimalt, British Columbia. Some of the scientists later wrote that of the crew, at least one was a confirmed drug addict, while another suffered a venereal disease. And despite orders of having no liquor to be carried on board, at least 2 of these crew members snuck supplies on. The scientists began to worry that the crew members did not have the qualities and characteristics needed to survive an expedition of this scale. Bartlett shared these concerns, and when he arrived in Esquimalt, his first act was to fire the first officer for incompetence and instead appoint 22-year-old Alexander Anderson. The Karluk was built in 1912, and it was a 2,000-ton wooden-hulled schooner built with the express purpose of navigating the Arctic. Despite its appearances, it was not as well suited for the icy conditions that it would face on the expedition. The Karluk would be powered by both sails and an engine. However, there were several concerns that the party had regarding the ship. The first was the ship's overall build and design. While the Karluk was solid and a very well-built vessel by all accounts, it was not an icebreaker. Icebreakers are specially designed with reinforced steel hulls that would allow them to plow through thick ice, and they have a rounded shape to the hull in order to lift the ship out of the ice when it is frozen instead of getting wedged in the ice, causing a high risk of damage. The Karluk, though reinforced, did not have the heavy steel hull or specialized shape necessary to consistently push through the dense and shifting ice over a long period of time. This made the ship vulnerable to being trapped or damaged when surrounded by heavier pack ice. Additionally, despite having an auxiliary engine, the engine was a sub-200 horsepower motor, while at the time it was generally considered that Arctic icebreakers would need to have about 3 to 5 times the power. Additionally, the ship was quoted to have inadequate reinforcements. The ship's wooden hull, while reinforced, was not built to withstand the immense pressures exerted by thick pack ice in the region. As the ice flow shifted and pressed up against the ship, the hull would begin to show signs of stress. It was not uncommon for wooden ships of this era to suffer damage from the grinding pressure of the ice, and the Karluk was no exception. By the time the ship would become trapped, the damage to the hull was already apparent, and the ship was not in a condition to survive prolonged entrapment. The ship's size and capacity was also of concern. The Karluk was a relatively small ship for the task at hand. It had limited storage for supplies and was not designed for long-term survivability in the extreme cold. Its size also meant it lacked the necessary maneuverability when surrounded by heavy ice or when the ice floes began to press around the ship. A larger, more robust ship would have been better for this task. The early part of the Karluk's journey was relatively smooth. Under Captain Bartlett's careful command, the ship navigated through the Bering Sea, around Alaska, and into the Chukchi Sea. Bartlett was a seasoned Arctic explorer and understood the dangers of navigating through the icy waters of the Arctic. So he was cautious, keeping the ship's speed moderate and closely monitoring the ice conditions as they moved northward. By the time the Karluk reached the Chukchi Sea, the ship encountered its first signs of trouble. The ice in the region was dense and started to shift, making navigation more difficult. Although it wasn't yet trapped, Captain Bartlett was aware that they were getting closer to areas where the ice could become an issue. Despite his caution, there was no immediate cause for alarm. Stefansson, with his ambition to explore, was eager to continue forward, even as the ice started to encroach on their path. In September 1913, the Karluk reached an area near Wrangel Island, which was one of their primary destinations for the expedition. Wrangel Island is located in the Arctic Ocean, just off the coast of Siberia, and was considered an ideal spot for Stefansson to conduct his studies of Arctic wildlife and indigenous cultures. It was here that the Karluk ran into more significant icy conditions. By late September, Bartlett started to notice that the ice was becoming much more formidable. While they were still able to navigate the ship through the ice floes, the pressure of the shifting ice was beginning to increase. Despite this, Stefansson was insistent that the ship continues its journey. Bartlett, despite his concerns, agreed to keep pushing forward. However, it soon became clear that the ice was too much for the ship to handle. As October arrived, the Karluk found itself surrounded by increasingly thick pack ice. The ice was shifting rapidly and unpredictably, which was a common problem in the Arctic during this time of year, and the ship's progress slowed drastically. There was growing concern among the crew as the ice pressed tighter around them. By early October 1913, the Karluk would completely become trapped in ice. The ship's wooden hull, while reinforced, was not designed for long-term ice entrapment. The hull began to buckle under the immense pressure of the shifting ice, and the crew tried for many days and many weeks to free the ship, but the ice was too thick and much too powerful. It was at this time Bartlett became increasingly concerned about the ship's ability to survive the coming winter. He and Stefansson both realized that their plans for exploration would have to be put on hold. The Karluk was now stuck, unable to move, and surrounded by ice in a region where temperatures would dip well below freezing, and they would be at the mercy of the ice floes. Bartlett, leaning on his experience, began to move supplies off of the ship onto the ice nearby, which was a risk. If the ice floes broke up, they could lose these supplies. However, should the ship go under and the hull be broken, this would ease the evacuation of the ship. It would only be a month later when Stefansson would make a very controversial decision. At this point, the situation grew more dire, and Stefansson made the decision to leave the ship. In late November 1913, he decided to leave Karluk with a small group of men and believed that he could make his way to Wrangel Island and continue his research. He left behind Bartlett and the rest of the crew, thinking that the ship would survive until spring and that they could all be rescued later. Stefansson and a small group of men set off across the ice, hoping to find a way out of the Arctic and to continue their work. This decision was critical because it meant that Captain Bartlett was now in command of the remaining crew, and with the ship stuck and no clear path or plan on how they would escape. To date, some people believe that Stefansson was trying to abandon the crew out of fear. After Stefansson's departure, the remaining crew of the Karluk, under Bartlett's leadership, prepared to survive the long Arctic winter. They were stranded, far from civilization, surrounded by crushing ice, and were at the mercy of the elements. As the days turned colder and darker, the crew's main focus shifted to find ways to survive, hunting for food, staying warm, and maintaining hope despite the growing dangers. The ship, already strained from the ice, continued to be battered throughout the winter. And by the time February 1914 arrived, the Karluk had been crushed by the shifting ice. The crew was forced to abandon ship and set out across the ice in search of safety, with Captain Bartlett taking charge of their survival efforts. The decision that Bartlett had made prior to move supplies onto nearby ice paid off. Despite the ship sinking, they were able to extract many of the supplies they came with, and only lost a few things along with the ship. Notably, Bartlett stayed on the ship until the very end, playing music, and, notably, when the ship did sink, he stepped off of the rail straight onto the ice, Captain Jack Sparrow style. Bartlett's decision to store supplies on the ice made sure that the survivors had a place to call home. Even as the ship sank beneath the crushing ice, the camp was born out of necessity. 2 shelters had been built, one a snow igloo with a canvas roof, and the other crafted out of packing cases that once held the Karluk's provisions. To the latter, a kitchen was added, using a large stove salvaged from the wreckage of the ship. In addition to this, a small shelter had been erected for the Inuit family, and a rough perimeter made out of coal bags and containers was used to outline their camp. In the words of McKinley, one of the survivors, the camp was a substantial and comfortable place that they could rely on for shelter even in the harshest of conditions. At this time, stores were plentiful, and for the moment, they were all well fed. The first days at Shipwreck Camp were spent adjusting clothing, preparing sleeping gear, and readying for the long march to Wrangel Island. But there was one catch: the ice drift, slowly moving the camp in the direction of Wrangel Island, although it was not fast enough, and in the end, they were getting further and away from the island. Bartlett knew that they needed more daylight before they could attempt the journey, but despite his caution, 3 men felt differently. McKay, Murray, and an anthropologist named Henry Bouchot felt they needed to leave. They had little interest in the community that was being established within Shipwreck Camp, and expressed their determination to set out on their own. Bartlett, knowing the journey ahead would be treacherous, wanted them to wait for better conditions. However, eventually, a few of the men convinced him to send out a smaller, trail-breaking group ahead of the larger party. On the 21st of January, a party of 4, which was to be led by Officer Alexander Anderson, would set out from Shipwreck Camp, with orders to establish a camp at Berry Point on Wrangel Island. They carried only essential supplies, but little did they know that this journey would be their last. As the time passed, Bartlett had not received any word back from the group of 4 men. As such, he sent out Bjarne Mammon as a scout to obtain news of the group of 4. By the 4th of February, Mammon had returned with tragic news. The group had not yet reached Wrangel Island. Instead, they had ended up a few miles short on what was likely Harold Island, 38 kilometers away from their intended destination. Mammon's account of the group of 4 would be the last anybody heard of the Anderson party. Their fate actually remained unknown for years until their remains were discovered nearly a decade later. Back at the camp, men did their best to survive, focusing their efforts on maintaining their food supplies, hunting for seals, and a number of other Arctic animals, and ensuring that they stayed warm enough to survive the freezing temperatures. Bartlett would lead hunting expeditions with his extensive Arctic knowledge. As previously mentioned, they mainly hunted seals and used harpoons and rifles, although on a few occasions they tried to take down a polar bear, to great challenge and often failure. The harsh conditions made hunting a challenge, and sometimes they would come back empty-handed. Heating was managed with the use of oil from the Karluk's engines. When that would later be used up, they would switch to seal blubber, which made do for their lamps and stove. Some of the wood from the ship was also used to build small fires. However, resources were limited, and as time passed, the cold becoming ever more present and threat to their survival. Overall, the men were well clothed and fairly well protected, with the Inuit using animal skins salvaged from the hunted to protect themselves from frostbite and hypothermia. With the limited resources the men had, they had to make do with whatever they could scrounge and whatever they could salvage. While overall Shipwreck Camp was comfortable, it did have its challenges. At top of mind was the limited number of supplies they had. Despite being able to salvage a majority of the stores on the Karluk, the crew was left with limited supplies of food, clothing, and tools. And their food supplies were dwindling rapidly. While the hunting expeditions did help sustain them, they were never fully secure in their food stores. Morale and exhaustion also became top of mind. The long Arctic winter would take its toll on the men, with short days and long nights. The men were exhausted with the constant struggle to stay alive. The brutal environment had left them in a constant state of physical and mental strain. Bartlett would try and keep the men moving and active, which helped maintain some morale, but as the months wore on, it became harder to keep hope alive. The constant cold, hunger, and isolation were wearing. As time passed, frostbite and sickness became a growing concern. The crew would grow more and more vulnerable to frostbite, illness, and exhaustion, and with limited medical supplies, the survivors had little recourse when injuries or sickness occurred. Men began to suffer from severe frostbite, and some were rendered unable to travel. Bartlett had to make the painful decision to leave those behind who could not continue the journey. By February in 1914, the situation at Shipwreck Camp had become untenable. The ice around them was shifting constantly, and as temperatures began to warm, there was increased risk of them going in the water. The crew was at the mercy of the Arctic elements. Bartlett and the remaining men decided that they needed to leave camp and had to attempt a way to safely travel to Wrangel Island. Packing up the camp, the survivors packed what they could, including tents, rifles, and other essential items. They would also pack sleds with food and gear that they could use during their trek across the ice as they prepared to leave. The reality of abandoning the camp and their last connection to the Karluk was devastating. Leaving the wrecked camp marked the beginning of a long, grueling trek across the ice. The survivors moved southward, hoping to reach open water or find help. But the journey was long, and many men fell behind or would succumb to the harsh conditions. I'm going to cut it off here, as this video is already getting a bit long for what I typically put out. Part 2 will pick up where we left off, with the men's journey across the ice, as well as the challenges Captain Bartlett would face in attempting to rescue them at the end of their journey. Thank you for watching again today, as we continue to explore some of Canada's mysteries, crimes, and disasters.